Hello, students. Hope you're doing well. Now, today we are going to be hearing a fantastic story, but also quite a sad story. But a fantastic story because it's got so many good parts to it. And it's not just any story, it's a story about murder. That's right, it's a murder story. And we are going to be detectives to figure out who is the murderer. Now, we've talked a lot about England and the royal families that governed and ruled over England. And it even seems in many cases that there have been a lot of dysfunction in the families that ruled in England. And not just dysfunction, but a lot of war. And indeed, that is true. Now, we saw most recently about the Wars of the Roses, which was a civil war that happened in England versus the Yorks and the Lancastrians. The Yorks were the white roses and the Lancastrians were the red roses. And there was a brutal civil war. And even the king, Henry VI, who was the king, had been even taken captive by the Yorks and specifically by the Duke of York named Richard. And then, even later on, the Duke of York was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and in fact, the Duke of York's head got chopped off, which was pretty brutal, and that was sort of as a result of Henry VI and his wife, Queen Margaret, who no longer wanted Richard to be around because he was causing so many problems, and they just wanted the Civil War to be over. They're just back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Well, after Henry VI was king, and then later after his death, we come alongside the next king of England named Edward. And when Edward died, we know that he left two sons. And these were the two princes, Edward and Richard. Now, I know it gets very confusing because there's a lot of people named Edward, there's a lot of people named Henry, there's a lot of people named Richard. But essentially, the two sons of King Edward, and Edward IV in particular is who the king was, and his wife, Elizabeth Woodville, they were both born during the intense turmoil of the Wars of the Roses. And these two princes, Edward and Richard, were both born during this time. Now, Edward IV died in the year 1483, and his brother, the Duke of Gloucester, later who became Richard III, would become the Lord Protector of Edward's son and heir, the 12-year-old Edward V. Well, this 12-year-old Edward V and his little brother Richard, they were very tragically asked to be sent into the Tower of London. And essentially the Duke immediately placed Edward in the Tower of London, closely followed by his 9-year-old brother Richard, because he wanted to protect them. This Richard III wanted to protect them. Now, what became of these young boys remains a mystery. In fact, they were never seen alive again after they were taken to the Tower of London. And in fact, even today, you can go to England and go to the Tower of London. But we may never know the truth about the poor princes, but they were victims of one of the most vicious interfamily conflicts. Now, remember, we joked in a recent history lesson that this family and the families in England at these times that were ruling and governing, it was sort of like a bad Christmas, right? They just couldn't get along. But this has now gone way beyond, right? That these two princes, Edward and Richard, would die. Now, this image that you're seeing here right now is an image that is very, very breathtaking. This is the image of where Elizabeth Woodville, Edward IV's wife, surrenders her younger son, Prince Richard, the Duke of York, to the Tower in an imagined scene by Philip Hermogenes Calderon in 1893. And in this scene, right, we see Elizabeth Woodville right here giving up her younger son, and that's her younger son right here. This is Richard. Not Richard III, but the younger son of Elizabeth Woodville, the Richard. I know there's a lot of Richard. But is being given up And it's very important for us to see sort of the pain that's happening here. Obviously, Elizabeth Woodville does not want to give up her younger son, Richard, here to the Tower of London. She's already had to give up her other son, who is supposed to be king, and all this stuff is happening, and she's feeling really stressed out and obviously very overwhelmed by the situation. Now, anyways, what you need to know is that this young boy, Richard, as well as Richard, the other prince, not Richard, but Richard's brother Edward, they are now in the Tower of London. And they're supposed to be protected by Richard III. And it's great that these boys have been reunited. They're in the Tower of London together, and that's all great and all. But in reality, there's a dark secret happening, that these boys are actually here and they are imprisoned. And the story goes that these two boys were never seen again. And the big question is, were these two boys murdered? And who would murder them? Now, this is a very sad story. Why would that happen? Well, why? Why would there be a murder? And certainly, why would a family member do that? Well, I think in this particular story, it's important to understand that being the King of England was very important, right? King of England was a vital role. And not only a vital role, but a wanted role. Right? Everybody wanted to be King of England. Right? You were king of the whole land, one of the most incredible nations in history. You would be in charge. And so the question is, the big question is, if we don't see these boys again, Richard III, who is supposed to be the protector and is now sort of acting as king, is he the one to blame? The one to blame for the disappearance and perhaps murder of these two boys, the prince, Richard and Edward. That's very interesting. So now we begin to think, right? We know that indeed, and this is a depiction of perhaps the history rewritten in a sense, thinking about these two innocent children, the two princes, Edward and Richard, perhaps that they were taken because people, especially maybe some noblemen, maybe some friends of Richard III that wanted Richard III to be the king forever, perhaps that is what's going on. Now, this is a scene that was imagined by an artist named James Northcote, thinking that perhaps these two princes were taken. Now, here's a guy who's a good-looking fella, but he looks like he's a pretty serious dude. And not only is he a pretty serious dude, but he might be up to no good. His name is Richard III. And this is the fella who was acting as the protector and was the acting king. Everybody say that with me. Acting king. Acting king of England. Because they did not think that Edward, the fifth is what he would be named, would be a good king. And so Richard III was acting king until Edward V became of the right age to where he could actually rule the country, which makes sense. But the question is, did he do it? Did he do it? Is this the man who killed these young boys? Did he do it, Richard III? That is a very interesting question. Or, let me introduce you to our next suspect. That's right, Henry Stafford. Now, Henry Stafford was the second Duke of Buckingham. Wow, quite the title. Second Duke of Buckingham. I've always wanted a really cool title. I don't know if I would do that, for example, but imagine being called a Duke. That sounds pretty awesome. Duke Goodwin of Houston. Right, that's Texas. Perhaps. Well, the second Duke of Buckingham was Richard's right-hand man. That's right, Richard's right-hand man. Well, what does that mean, right-hand man? Well, Richard, right, certainly as the acting king, needed quite a few things handled for him, right, so that he was not looking poor or anything like that. So this second Duke of Buckingham was kind of the guy that sort of helped Richard do the things he needed, right? So this was Richard's right-hand man. And not only that, there are theories that he took it upon himself to murder the boys to actually gain King Richard's favor. However, this Henry Stafford, we don't think he actually did this because he was later, he actually fell out of Richard's favor and was actually executed for treason. But that does mean if he was executed for treason, which means that he was going against his country of England, perhaps he is a suspect. So, big question, did he do it? I don't know. Well, another suspect is a guy named Henry VII. Ooh, nice big name. Well, Henry VII was the grandson of Queen Margaret. Now, if you remember back, Henry VI, or excuse me, not the grandson, excuse me, the son of Henry VI and Queen Margaret. And following his takeover of the throne from Richard III in 1485, that's right, in 1485, this Henry VII became king. He actually believed that these two boys had been murdered, but many people thought that it was actually Henry VII who murdered these two boys so that he could become king. Did he do it? Well, why would he do it? Well, he was certainly upset that Richard III was acting king, and not only that, he was upset that if Richard III wasn't acting king, that this Edward fella would have done it. Now, if you think back about the story of the Wars of the Roses, you know that there was a big war that happened between the Yorks and the Lancastrians, and Henry was a part of the Lancastrians because he was the son of Henry VI. And so he said, you know what, I think I have the right to be king. But indeed, he was not, because Edward V was going to be king, but he wasn't old enough to rule, and he died. So many people think that Henry VII did it, or at least he hired somebody to do this. So that's very interesting. Now, another suspect was a guy. Oh, actually, I don't think I have. Oh, yes, I do. Here he is. John Howard is his name. Ooh, John Howard. Did John Howard do it? Well, he was a loyal friend of Richard III. Friend of Richard III. Perhaps he did this for Richard III. And he had custody of the tower at the time the princes disappeared. Interesting. He was there. He was there at the time of disappearance. Very interesting. He later gained young Richard, Duke of York's Norfolk estate and title. So not only that, but he also gained from the death of these two princes. So perhaps he did it. It actually sounds like he actually definitely is a prime suspect because he gained so much from the death of these two boys. And not only that, he was in charge of the tower at the time the princes disappeared. Okay, well, let's look at one last suspect. Could it be Queen Margaret? Ooh, do you remember Queen Margaret? I sure do. I remember it was her that sort of led to the sort of ultimate victory of the Lancastrians in the battle of the Wars of the Roses. And Queen Margaret, she was an intense woman. In fact, she was probably the prime reason why Richard, the Duke of York, had his head chopped off because Queen Margaret was an intense lady. But Margaret was the mother of the future Henry VII and paternal grandmother to Henry VIII. And this highly intelligent. So she was very smart. But she was also very manipulative. Perhaps she is the one who did it. And she was Lancastrian, so she certainly didn't like the Yorks. So that was very interesting as well. But she was a Lancastrian matriarch, and she would have done anything to ensure that her son Henry would become next on the throne. And so the question is, did this include getting these young princes out of the way so that her son could rule? Well, she certainly had a very well-known spy network. Ooh, spy. Very interesting. So perhaps she had one of her spies do it, or one of the men that were loyal to her. Maybe they did it for her. So there's some very interesting questions here, right? Some big question marks. Did Margaret do it? Well, I think in many ways, right, this is a story that is very sad, because we actually know, right, in this particular situation that this Richard, right, that Richard certainly did not want this. I certainly didn't want to get rid of being king as being protector. So, this is interesting. Was it Queen Margaret? Was it John Howard? Was it Henry VII? Was it the second Duke of Buckingham? Was it Richard III? Who was it that killed these boys? Well, we don't know. And we can only speculate. But nearly 200 years later, in 1674, King Charles II ordered the demolition of what remained of the royal palace to the south of the White Tower. The location included a turret that had once contained, now a turret's like a large tower, that once contained a privy staircase leading to St. John's Chapel. And you know what? Beneath the foundations of the staircase, some 10 feet below the ground, the workmen were astonished to find a wooden chest that contained 2 skeletons the size of 2 young boys. Now, that, my friends, sounds like they definitely were murdered. So, that is the story of the 2 young princes that had to live in the Tower of London. It's very sad. Very, very sad. But the big question is, who did it?